agree with Marcelo that once you reach a certain point in driving pressure, in excursion, in strain threshold, once you cross the threshold, then frequency does become important. The power, the intensity, the repetition becomes very important. Below that level, if the strain is below threshold level, then you have the freedom to increase frequency to a very high level. You can think of an athlete with a homogeneous lung that is actually pulling a lot of power through the lung and not damaging it because it hasn't reached a critical strain threshold. But when you're in the setting of ARDS, where you have a small lung, you have many interfaces that are not homogeneous. There's stress amplification. There's dropout of the filamentous connections between the alveoli. Then power becomes a very important issue. So a threshold is important, and once you cross the threshold, frequency becomes very important. You can't lump frequency and power and say, you know, if I manipulate frequency and generate a high power and I don't damage lungs, that it's not important. Frequency is important once you cross the threshold, and once you cross the threshold, frequency is intrinsically related to power. And of course, as I mentioned before, a pressure alone doesn't do the trick. You have to consider the excursion of the strain that you're talking about.
I think I'm very grateful for John for everything that in my, let's say, research career, and then and I think this whole discussion about power was very enlightful for me because it brought the importance of frequency into the stage, and I think frequency is an important component. And John had many experimental studies beforehand showing that the respiratory rate can impact the lung injury. But I think I would like to stress this point that it's important to analyze single parameters because there is a kind of priority of risks. Looks like that the biological system is very sensitive to the cyclic stretch, which means that the driving pressure has a kind of priority, and then obviously respiratory rate is the second component. And I believe that when we lump together everything into the power concept, we miss this priority, and then this is my major point.
Okay, a question from the audience. You'll have to come up here because there's no microphone. So give him the microphone, please.
My question is that your concept, what you're seeing, and what we're aiming for theoretically is basically HFO, right? So high frequency oscillation, minimizing driving pressure at the cost of frequency. So what makes you think that never translated to clinical success? Because none of the study has shown that it's beneficial.
So the question is, if the principle is increasing driving pressure further and you don't care about the frequency, then you can go to a high frequency oscillation system, HFO, and that should accomplish the same thing.
I think there are multiple reasons why the high frequency can fail. But one of the reasons is that we did some computations. Okay, after this presentation, and in patients, we could compute that there are only two parameters to consider, driving pressure and frequency. Driving pressure is 5 times more important than frequency. But then, when you go to high frequency oscillation, you are increasing the respiratory rate by, let's say, 100 times, almost 100 times. And then, even if this component is small, it gets very big because you are increasing 100 times. And pay attention that driving pressure during high frequency oscillation is not that small. I have measured this, and typically when you're using 5 hertz, it's about 6 to 8 centimeters of water. So, which is, let's say, it's not so small. We have patients under conventional ventilation with that amount of driving pressure. The problem is that then you increase by 100 times in terms of frequency, and then it is potentially deleterious, even if you don't agree with the power concept.
Thank you. I was going to make a comment. I've spent a fair amount of time studying high-frequency ventilation, as you know, over the past 40 years. And what we see is that what they did in the Toronto study is they turned up the driving pressure so that it was really not low tidal volume. And number 2, and this is one of the things that Marcelo didn't mention, is that there can be a standing wave of pressure if you have a high frequency of inspiratory flow rate, which is often done to maintain the CO2 ventilation and the low tidal volumes. So even though the theory behind high frequency oscillation should be correct, you're doing 3 things differently. You're having an acceleration, which means that the energy is greater than the tidal volume and frequency would say because of the flow rate, number 1. Number 2, the pressures you're generating in the alveoli are often much higher than you'd be predicting from the airway pressure, and clearly it's not possible to measure plateau pressure when you are on high frequency oscillation. And number 3, the viscoelastic properties greatly increase the input of frequency, as Marcelo said. So with that, we are out of time. The next session is starting in approximately 5 minutes. I want to thank the 2 speakers for a really interesting discussion and the audience for their participation.